Hello. I'm a bit late. Any of you who have noticed the time on this video may realise, because I'm supposed to do live broadcasts at 11:15, and I did. But clearly my phone is having a bit of a Monday moment. I kind of sympathise, because it's the same for all of us, isn't it, on a Monday? And so about 18 minutes into a 22-minute reading, it just went very, very glitchy and lost about half a paragraph. And I just thought, you know what, I'll just do it again. So here we are. Here we go again. So we're here today for chapter 3 of Slaves for the Isabella. Joe went with Hannah, the woman who seemed to recognise him down in the town in Bristol. And it turns out she seems to be a servant of some sort at a big house. And at the big house, he recognises Morley from one of Lucy's previous worlds. So he knows he's in the right place. Morley is the butler this time, having been the steward before. And Morley is about to show him into the room where Lucy should be waiting, and has introduced him as Josiah de Courson, which is who they think he is. Okay, chapter 3. But Lucy wasn't in the room he entered. Instead, her mother rose to greet him. Josiah, this is an unexpected pleasure. She wore a grey silk dress with a high waist and a swathe of material at the bosom. Her mouth was turned up in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The room itself was not very large, but it was elegant and light, with a high ceiling and a tall window that overlooked the street. 2 chairs were drawn up either side of the fire. Between them was a prim sofa in pink silk with a curvy back, like a huge mouth waiting to eat him, Joe thought. Above the mantelpiece, a circular mirror made the room appear to bulge. Madam. Joe stopped in front of Ellen and bowed, disconcerted that she didn't seem very happy to see him. Aunt Ellen, please, she corrected him. We can't be too formal. You may be staying for a long time. She motioned him to sit down. I'm sorry we weren't there to meet you. My sister wrote that we should expect you tomorrow or the day after, depending on the weather. Did you have a good crossing? Yes, thank you. Joe's brain was whirring. Hannah had mentioned a ship, and Josiah's surname sounded French. He must be coming across the English Channel. Morley tells me that our cook happened to see you down in the city. Your luggage is to follow, I assume? That's right, Joe agreed. And how are you? A sympathetic note crept into Ellen's voice. I know my sister will be glad to have you safe in England. I wrote to her that she and your father are most welcome to join you here at any time. Your father still believes it won't be necessary. I pray he's right. She bit her lip, then said quickly, Of course, there's no need for you to worry. Everything will turn out for the best, I'm sure. Joe tried to adopt a suitable expression without quite knowing what it should be. It sounded as though Josiah's family was in some kind of trouble. Just then the door opened. Ah, here's your cousin. Lucy's mother was plainly relieved to change the subject. The girl, who crossed the room towards Joe, wore a long blue gown, drawn in at the waist with a ribbon. Her hair tumbled over her shoulders in a dark mass, neither pinned up nor covered by any kind of cap. Joe watched the graceful way she moved. Then the familiar blue eyes caught his gaze. Something flipped over inside him. He stood up. Lucy! It should have been an exclamation of delight, but it came out as a croak. His mouth seemed to have turned to wood, and his arms felt rigid, even though his chest swelled with happiness at seeing her again. Cousin Josiah, Lucy replied coolly. How do you do? She curtsied. Her tone was like a needle puncturing Joe's pleasure. He cleared his throat. I'm well, thank you. He didn't sound terribly friendly either, he realised. Were they both suffering from the same horrible shyness? He felt as though he'd been frozen to the spot. Yet there was nothing shy about Lucy's manner. Had she perhaps realised immediately that he wasn't Josiah? But there was no sign of that either. Joe floundered. If Lucy believed him to be her cousin and she wasn't shy, why was she so offhand? "Are you well yourself?" he asked, bending himself to bow. "I am, thank you." She raised her eyebrows. "Your English has improved. You don't have an accent at all now. Have you been in the country long?" For a moment Joe was confused. "I've only just arrived," he said. Then he realised what she meant. Presumably he should have had a French accent, but it was too late to put one on now. "How are your parents and brothers?" Lucy asked. "They're well, thank you," Joe said. He waited to see if she would reveal anything about them. "My brother will be sorry that Henry isn't with you," she said. "Is he still studying in Paris, or is it too dangerous now?" Lucy's mother shot her a look. "Shall we have some tea?" she interrupted. "Now?" There was no mistaking Lucy's surprise. "Why not?" Ellen forced a smile. "It's not every day we have an occasion such as this. Why don't you both sit down?" She picked up a small bell from a table beside the chair and rang it. At once a footman in livery appeared. He must have been standing right outside the door. "Bring us the tea things, please, Jackson," Ellen said, "and perhaps something to eat." She looked at Joe. "I expect you breakfasted early on the ship. Are you hungry?" Joe was suddenly aware of the cavernous feeling in his stomach. How had he managed to forget how starving he'd been? It must be over an hour since he left Dad. "Yes, I am," he replied enthusiastically. "Ask Hannah to send up some luncheon as well, then, please, Jackson," Lucy's mother said curtly. "You may remember, Josiah, we eat earlier in this household than more fashionable houses. We have breakfast soon after 8, rather than 10, and dinner at 2 instead of 4. Joe nodded, hoping his puzzlement didn't show. Breakfast he could understand, but if Hannah was going to provide lunch now, in the middle of the morning, did that mean dinner was the evening meal? And if so, was it at 2 in the afternoon, which would be weirdly early for the evening, or 2 in the morning, which would be ridiculously late? "Your uncle likes a good meal when he returns from the sugar house," Ellen was saying. "We're so used to that routine that we keep to it even though he's away." "Has he been gone long?" Joe asked cautiously. He knew this was risky. Josiah might be expected to know the answer already, but equally, if he wasn't, it would seem odd not to ask. "He's out in the West Indies," Ellen said. "His brother James died last summer. James had lived out there for years with his wife and son. Truth be told, we're rather afraid of the state of his plantation. He was a very different man to my husband." She checked herself. "In any case, his widow wrote to William, begging him to come and help settle James's affairs. Her letter arrived in October, and he sailed the same week." "But that's 4 months ago," Joe said. As soon as he'd spoken, he was afraid he'd made a mistake. Was it February here, like it was at home? But Ellen nodded. "The voyage can take as long as 2 months, you know," she said. "Even if he'd turned for home the day he arrived in Jamaica, he'd scarcely be back by now. And how long it will take for him to make the necessary arrangements, we simply don't know." "So it's just the 2 of you and Peter in the house besides the servants?" Joe ventured. This was really dangerous ground, but it was worth taking a chance to find out. "And Thomas," Ellen said, "did you not know I had another child? He's upstairs with his nurse." "Is he ill?" Joe asked without thinking. "No. At least, not as far as I know. Why do you ask?" Lucy's mother frowned. Joe blushed and shook his head. It was a silly thing to have said. The word nurse used to mean something like nanny, he remembered now, but his brain had connected the modern meaning with the memory of Lucy's baby brother dying during the plague in her last world. He studied his hands, embarrassed and perplexed. Hadn't that baby been called Thomas too? Was this the same boy? Surely it couldn't be. Lucy's older brother, Matthew, had died when she lived in Tudor times, and he'd still been dead when Jo met her again in London. Similarly, her sisters Anne and Cecily had died in Lucy's last life. They didn't seem to be here, nor did he expect to see them, any more than he expected to see her long-dead brother Francis. So how could the baby be alive again? When Jo looked up, there was a tightness in Ellen's expression. An awkward silence fell, broken only when the footman entered the room. He set the tray he was carrying down beside Ellen. On it were 3 cups with saucers, 2 silver pots, a bowl of something white, and a plate of dainty little sandwiches. Even if he ate them all, Jo knew he would still be hungry. So luncheon must just be a snack, and dinner must be what he would think of as lunch. Lucy rose and took a small key from her mother, went to the bureau, unlocked it, and brought back a polished wooden box. Ellen produced a second key and unlocked the box. What could be in there, Jo wondered, that was so precious? Inside were 2 compartments with a glass bowl in between. Lucy's mother opened both and spooned something dark and dry from each one into a bowl. She stirred, breathed in the fragrance, then added another spoonful before emptying the bowl into one of the silver pots and adding hot water from the other through a tiny tap. This must be the tea, Jo realised. He had no idea tea had ever been so valuable, or the process for making it so careful. Ellen locked the box again and gave it to Lucy to put away. Jo looked at the tray. Was the bowl of white stuff sugar? It didn't look much like it. The pieces were sharp, uneven shards, as though a larger block had been broken up quite roughly. All the same, he couldn't think what else it could be. Ellen added a spoonful to each cup and handed one to Jo. He took a sip slightly hesitantly. He didn't usually drink tea at home, but this tasted more or less like he expected, and it was sweet too. Lucy's mother now picked up the sandwich platter and handed it to Jo with a plate and fork. Again Jo was surprised, but this time he had to hide a smile. He'd become quite the historian, he thought, because it wasn't the idea of eating sandwiches with a fork that had struck him as unusual. It was the fact that there were forks. There had never been forks in the past. There hadn't been tea or sandwiches either, of course. Really, this place felt altogether much more familiar than Lucy's earlier times. As he was finishing the sandwiches he had taken, the clock in the hall chimed very loudly. Jo counted. 10 o'clock. Lucy needs to return to her studies, Ellen said, suddenly brisk. Would you like to rest, Josiah? Morley can show you to your room. Or you can go with your cousin to her lessons, if you wish. I'm sure Miss Waters won't mind. I'll go with Lucy, Jo answered swiftly. The chiming clock had reminded him that he didn't know The chiming clock had reminded him that he didn't know how long he would be here. He should make the most of every second. Lucy stood up. Very well, she said. Jo thought he saw her grimace. He bowed to Ellen, then followed Lucy out of the room. Who's your teacher? He asked as they went down the hall. I have a governess. Lucy didn't look at him as she spoke. She gives me lessons every day except Sunday. She led the way up the stairs to the first floor landing. A door stood open ahead of them. It seemed to be the dining room. Do you eat meals up here? He asked. Of course. Don't you remember? Not very well, I'm afraid, he said. How long were we here? I don't recall. Over a month, Lucy said tersely. Long enough. Jo winced, partly at his apparent lack of memory of such a long stay, but mostly at her tone. Lucy had been angry with him in the past, generally when she'd found out that he had lied to her about who he really was. but underneath it all he'd still felt pretty sure she liked him. This time he was sure she didn't. She continued up another flight of stairs to the second floor, not troubling to point out what any of the rooms were. "In here," she said, pushing open one of the doors. The room was small but light and looked out over the garden. A young woman sat on a bed reading. She stood up quickly and closed the book. Her dark hair was wound up at the back of her head, and she wore a long dark dress. She looked vaguely familiar, Jo thought. "You're back, Miss Lucy," she said. "I thought perhaps we'd finished for the day." Jo closed his eyes for a second. He knew this voice, he was sure. He searched around in his memory for someone from Lucy's world with a name like Waters, but there wasn't anyone. "This is my cousin, Josiah de Courson," Lucy was saying. "My mother's sister married a French count, you may remember. Josiah's staying for a while, until things settle down over there." Miss Waters gave a little curtsy. "Enchantée, Maître Josiah. Vous êtes très bienvenu pour nous rejoindre." Panic rose inside Jo. He'd started French at school last year, but he wasn't up to any sort of conversation, never mind trying to pass himself off as French. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Miss Waters," he said determinedly in English. "Goodness, what perfect pronunciation!" Miss Waters exclaimed. "But of course, your mother must have taught you." She turned back to Lucy. "Is Master Josiah to be schooled with you, Miss Lucy, not Master Peter?" "Peter's school isn't expecting him until next week." "So he'll join our lessons for the next few days?" "If he wishes." It was perfectly clear from Lucy's voice that she didn't. "Let's begin our reading lesson then. Perhaps you would like to draw up that chair from the corner, Master Josiah." Miss Waters pointed to a stubby armchair like the ones downstairs. It looked more comfortable than the wooden seats she and Lucy were sitting on. Jo did as he was told, waiting for Lucy to scowl at him again. But she ignored him and pulled a huge leather-bound Bible towards her. She began to read from where Miss Waters indicated, running her finger along the page. Jo listened to her stumbling over words that weren't especially difficult. Then came a section which she read faultlessly, as though she knew it off by heart. He paid closer attention. The language was older and more poetic than the Bible they used at his school, but these were the 10 Commandments. That was why she knew it. After that, she read on hesitantly again, before breaking off altogether. "Shouldn't Josiah read some?" "Very well." The governess pushed the Bible across the desk towards Jo. "Exodus chapter 21, verse 15. Jo gulped. He wasn't used to finding the verses like this. He scanned the page until he spotted the number 15 and began. "And he that..." He paused. The next word was formiteth. He glanced through the text. There were lots of F's, but hardly any of them made sense. "Smiteth," prompted Miss Waters. "Right. He that smiteth his father or his mother..." Jo stopped again. Here were 2 more. This wasn't as easy as he'd thought. "Shall be surely," read Miss Waters. "Oh, the F's are actually S's. Shall be surely put to death, and he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found..." Should that be sound? No, found. "He that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death." Miss Waters nodded. "Continue." For some time Jo read on. It was tricky spotting the F's before he misread them, but he got better at it. Soon he was reading a good deal more fluently than Lucy. "Very good," Miss Waters said, as he came to the end of the chapter. "I think Miss Lucy should read on from here." Lucy glared. For the next hour or so, they took it in turns to read. Joe read better and better, and looked forward to his turn because it gave him something to do. Listening to Lucy struggle was frustrating and dull. At last, Miss Waters said, "That's enough for today. I've been thinking perhaps we should make the most of the fact that we have Master Josiah with us." Lucy glowered, but Joe looked up with interest. Perhaps the governess was about to suggest something more fun. "Why don't we vary our usual routine?" Miss Waters went on. "Instead of working on your writing next, I propose we continue with French. It will be much better for you to practice with Master Josiah than with me, Miss Lucy. Shall we do that?" So, that's a disaster for Joe. He's got, a year of school French. He can't hold a conversation. He can't pretend to be French. And now he's supposed to be guiding Lucy through her French lesson. It's just hopeless. So he's going to have to put a stop to that. If he can think of a way to do it, or else he's going to get really, really found out. And why is it Lucy is so displeased to see him? And where is Josiah de Courson? And what will happen when Josiah de Courson turns up? There are all sorts of things. And why is Josiah de Courson coming? What is going on there? Can you guess? Do you know? I don't think we've worked out yet what the year is. Joe will work that out quite shortly, but he hasn't yet. I wonder if you can work out what it is. Right. So, sorry about that, having to redo that. I hope that the lateness doesn't make any odds to you. And I hope to see you tomorrow for Chapter 4. Okay, thanks.